We are here with the grand finale of our evolution unit. This is the history of life. So here's where we look at what has actually happened over the course of Earth's history and how the species we see have changed over time. So the Earth is 4.54 billion years old. And, the two main questions that we're going to ask in this section is how did life originate on Earth and how has it changed throughout the course of evolution? And we're going to start with that second question, how has it changed? So there's some things that have affected the history of life on Earth in pretty significant ways, much of which you've already learned earlier in the year, but we're just going to kind of bring them back to kind of remind us of their impact on the grander scale of things. So one factor that's had a huge impact is plate tectonics. So the fact that these continents move around across the planet, it means that as these continents move, it alters habitats as things get closer or further away from the poles. Um, it can separate species. You can see how these were at one point overlapping and then they were separated later. Creates opportunities for allopatric speciation. We saw this in Australia, how the placental mammals were kind of isolated there. And basically just things change. Antarctica, for example, used to be a forest and there were dinosaurs running around the surface of Antarctica. But slowly it migrated south and it became isolated and cold ocean currents surrounded it, and now it's pretty much devoid of life, which is kind of crazy to think about. Another factor, speciation, had a whole chapter on this, so we won't say too much about it, but new species arising obviously has a pretty big impact on the history of life on Earth. Recall allopatric speciation happens when a population is separated into different groups and then they start to diverge. Sympatric, that isolation happens while they're all still kind of hanging out together. Mass extinctions. We haven't talked too much about this. There have been 5 major mass extinction events in the past. You can see on the y-axis here total extinction rate. And this is millions of years ago, from 542 million years ago to the present. And you kind of see these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spikes where there's been pretty significant numbers of species who've been wiped out in a pretty short period of time. The biggest one of all, you probably have never heard of. It was called the Permian extinction because it happened at a point in history called the Permian era between what's called the Paleozoic and Mesozoic, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. The cause of this, as best we can tell, was extreme volcanic activity. It added carbon dioxide, raising the temperatures. Those raised temperatures reduced the temperature differences at the poles. And then because there was less temperature difference at the poles, that affected ocean currents. And there was less mixing of ocean water and oxygen levels dropped. That allowed these anaerobic bacteria to thrive. They produced this toxic hydrogen sulfide gas, which damaged the ozone layer and just became toxic and killed even more. 96% of marine life went extinct. And note that was 6-degree temperatures. So as we talk about current climate change, 2 degrees Celsius is what they're trying to cap it as. And you can see like 6 degrees doesn't seem like much, but that's bad, obviously. The mass extinction you likely have heard of is the one that knocked out the dinosaurs. This was between what's called the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, which again we'll talk about later. This one was, we are now certain, was caused by a meteorite hitting Earth, kicked up a bunch of dirt and debris that blocked out the sun for months. Photosynthesis can't take place, bad things happen. And a lot of people don't realize that the dinosaurs were actually already on the decline before that happened, and this was kind of the thing that just finished the job. Spoiler alert for our ecology unit, we're actually in the middle of a 6th mass extinction right now, caused pretty much entirely by human activity. We are losing species at a rate unprecedented since this extinction right here, which is kind of a bummer to think about, but we'll talk more about that in ecology. Another factor affecting Earth's life's history are adaptive radiations, and we've talked about how that's the rapid diversification of species into many other species. And so this diagram kind of shows this, for much of history, we had these dinosaur groups kind of dominating. And then this thin red line represents birds, this thin green line represents mammals, and this thin yellow line is crocodiles. And after the dinosaurs went extinct, basically there are all these new habitats that opened up. And so there was rapid evolution amongst birds and mammals. Not sure what the crocodiles were doing. I guess they were just happy how they were. But this adaptive radiation led to this, rapid speciation here. Mammals in the time of dinosaurs were pretty much like little popcorn. It was basically rodents and things like that, things no larger than your hand. But then once the dinosaurs went extinct, they had opportunities to diversify. So this chart kind of shows the geological record, and we're going to do a real quick once over that just kind of looks at the major things that have happened from the first evidence of animal life all the way up through the modern day. And the first major time period is what's called the Precambrian era. This is 4.5 billion years ago, basically the origin of the Earth, to 542 million years ago. Now you're probably wondering how I can't visualize how long a time period. So what I like to do is use what I call the wingspan analogy. This young child who probably has no idea I have his picture on here, just found it on the internet. If you imagine your wingspan, like your arms, representing the history of life on Earth, the Precambrian era would be like starting on the tip of one finger and all the way to the wrist of your opposite hand. So the Precambrian era is by far and away the longest section here that we're going to be looking at. And what's interesting is not a whole lot was going on in the Precambrian. For the first 100 million years or so, Earth was being bombarded by leftover debris. There was no water on the Earth's surface because it was pretty much instantly vaporized from the heat of all this activity. So not much going on with life there. Just bare rock. Eventually oceans formed, but there was no life there. And it's kind of weird to think about just a barren landscape, just no plants, no life, no nothing. There are actually Precambrian rocks at the surface in northern Minnesota. So if you've ever been to Gooseberry Falls or some of those state parks on the North Shore, you were walking on rock that was laid down during the Precambrian era, which is kind of cool. Eventually, 3.5 billion years ago, we see the very first evidence of life. And these are these things called stromatolites. And the stromatolite is this layered rock-like structure. And here's a picture of the early Earth, and you can see these little stromatolites are these little bumps in the water there. They basically are made by bacteria. So bacteria form a layer, and then they have this kind of sticky, it's a biofilm really, this sticky layer, and debris will attach to that sticky layer and accumulate. And then the bacteria migrate above it, and then more debris sticks to them, and then more bacteria divide and move. And so you get this alternating pattern of, bacteria, debris, and it kind of looks like this in the fossil record. It kind of looks like this in life. Stromatolites still exist. I've held a stromatolite. I was in the Bahamas and got to hold a stromatolite, which is pretty cool. So they're still around. They're around Australia and some other places. And we've seen this fossilized stromatolites 3.5 billion years ago, which shows us that the first life on Earth, at least that we have evidence of, were in fact bacteria, which would make sense since they're some of the simplest cells we know of. And then here's just some people chilling amongst the stromatolites because, hey, why not? It's a good date night. Another major event, 2.5 billion years ago, we saw the accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere. So until this point, there was not a whole lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, which is kind of weird to think about. It was living creatures that put that oxygen there, and you should know what biochemical process would result in the production of that oxygen. One of the major ones, think about it. What one was it? Did you say photosynthesis? I hope you did, because it was photosynthesis. And so these bacteria, called cyanobacteria, that were around then, were producing this oxygen. So pause, did they have chloroplasts? And if not, how did they produce the proton gradient for ATP production? And hopefully you said, no, they don't, because if they're bacteria, Bacteria do not have organelles, so they don't have a chloroplast, and so they use their cell membrane for that proton gradient. Um, the evidence for this are what are called the banded iron formations. Here's your stereotypical tourist in front of the banded iron formations, and it's these rock layers that kind of alternate between pure iron and rust. Pure iron and rust. So if oxygen's in the atmosphere, it's going to rust the iron, and you're going to see this reddish stuff. And so what these rocks show is that when these rocks were developed and laid down, these areas that were not rust, there wasn't oxygen in the atmosphere, and so we see these kind of fluctuating oxygen levels in the atmosphere as these rocks were laid down. We also see the accumulation of eukaryotic cells 2.1 billion years ago, and this is a process we've talked about at some length in here. Do you remember how this happened? Give you a hint, a smaller cell got taken into a larger cell and became, what did it become? The mitochondria? Did you say mitochondria? Hopefully you did. Here's a little video clip of it, which I think it's worth clicking that. So I'd recommend watching that video, just kind of remind yourself how this process took place. And so you can see a lot of pretty significant foundational things occurred during that Precambrian era. And yeah. That takes us to the next area, the Paleozoic. The Paleozoic is 542 to 251 million years ago. On our wingspan analogy, remember Precambrian took us from this fingertip all the way to his wrist. This will be about the length of his hand. So up to where his first fingers come off. That is the Paleozoic. We see the origin of simple animals. So cells are coming together to form animals now. And they called this point the Cambrian explosion because of this sudden appearance of large amounts of fossils in the fossil record. This was a problem for Darwin. It looked like a creation event, and Darwin didn't have a great answer for it. We now know the reason is that shells and hard parts were formed, and they fossilized well, which is why they suddenly appeared. Prior to that, you'd expect if there were animals before that, you'd expect to find fossils of them. And we have in what's called the Burgess Shale, this type of rock in Canada. They've found fossils of soft-bodied creatures that look like this prior to the Cambrian explosion. So we know there were simpler animals without hard parts before that Cambrian era. Every modern phyla of animals was represented by the time the Paleozoic began. And throughout the Paleozoic, we see diversification of invertebrates and the origin and diversification of vertebrates. So fish evolved into amphibians, amphibians evolved into reptiles, and then plants and animals colonized land as well. So we've talked about how Tiktaalik was kind of this key transitional fossil for fish making the move onto land. Simple plants, moss-like creatures did that, and then kind of insect-like things for insects too. The Mesozoic era, 251 to 65 million years ago, this on our wingspan would be the next 2 digits of your finger. So up to that last digit of your finger would be the Mesozoic era. This was the age of dinosaurs. Interestingly, the movie Jurassic Park features animals like Triceratops, Velociraptor, Tyrannosaurus Rex, which actually existed in the Cretaceous, not the Jurassic era. Oh well, it's still a cool movie. We see the origin of birds, and we talk about Archaeopteryx as this key transition, and then the origin of mammals. And again, they're just kind of like the popcorn for the dinosaurs at this point, tiny little things. We also see the origin of conifers, which are like cone evergreens and whatnot, and then flowers. And interestingly, grass. Grass is a flowering plant. These are the flowers of grass. We see it everywhere on Earth today. At the time of the dinosaurs, there was none. Finally, the Cenozoic era, 65 million years ago to the present. So at the extinction of the dinosaurs, the Cenozoic began. This is that very last digit of your finger. We saw the adaptive radiation of mammals. The ice ages came and went, so woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, eventually leading to our modern thing. And then we see, whoops, forgot that picture. We see the origin of humans, 6 to 2 million years ago. These are all living primate skulls of all the primates alive today. These are extinct human relatives. There's 15 to 20 known species of humans that are now extinct, and that's weird. We don't know much about them. You could pile every fossil of a human of another species into the back of a pickup truck. So we don't have many fossils of these guys, but we do know they existed. Um,